Welcome to video 3 of the Performance Puzzle playlist. I'm Jason Hettler, and today we're going to discuss practice organization. But before we get into that, let's recap what's been covered so far. In video 1, we talked about managing complexity and doing so through understanding output and understanding change. In that video, we defined change as the product of observation plus intent. In video 2, we covered the observation half of the equation and discussed how we can improve our observational abilities through consistent surveillance and utilizing the Altis iceberg model. Now here in video 3, we're going to cover the intent half of the equation, and we're going to do so through practice organization. To begin the conversation, we need to talk about learning versus performance. Performance may be temporary, but learning must be permanent. It is comprised of acquisition and retention, and when it is the objective of the session, we have to ask ourselves, how can we promote learning? This leads us into blocked versus random practice. This is something you've probably been exposed to before, so we'll just give a brief overview. An example of block practice would be, say we're going to do 3 elements within a training session: plyometrics, sprints, and medicine ball throws. Block practice would mean we do all the plyometrics, and then all of the sprints, and then all of the medicine ball throws. This practice design enhances performance and depresses learning. A random practice design for the same example would be doing a plyometric and then a sprint and then a medicine ball throw and repeating, or being truly random and doing plyometric, medicine ball throw, sprint, medicine ball throw, plyometric, sprint, whatever kind of random order you would want to come up with. Just know that trials are never performed more than once in order, and learning was enhanced by intra-task interference, or keeping multiple items in working memory at once. This is an idea we'll come back to in a bit. Some further thoughts on random practice. It prompts the learner to compare and contrast between tasks, resulting in a more memorable and meaningful experience. It's a very powerful statement in my mind. More memorable and meaningful experience for the athlete. Further, we can see that the more meaning assigned to a task, the more the learner will retain, a key component of learning. From Shea Zimny, 1983, we see that participants in random groups provide much more elaborate descriptions of the task. Participants in block groups report little thought processing and run automatically. Really interesting finding in my mind, because these both highlight that there is a time and a place for each. During practice, when learning is the outcome goal, elaborate descriptions from the athletes, in my mind, lead to great conversations about what is occurring. But there's also a time and a place that we want the athletes to run automatically. That'll obviously be in competition or leading into a competition. And so understanding how we can facilitate this through blocked and random practice organization becomes key. Conversation about learning can't be complete without including Nikolai Bernstein. He recognized movement as a closed circle of interaction between the nervous system and the sensory environment, subsequently highlighting the need for feedback. Feedback can come in many different ways, but we can also think about feedback as variability. Within his degrees of freedom problem, Bernstein tells us that through stage 1, as a novice athlete or novice mover is learning a skill, they will experience high variability in their process. As they gain experience, that variability in their process will start to decline. And then, as they become a masterful mover or executor of the skill, they see increased variability, this time associated with low outcome variability. In other words, they have many different solutions to the movement problem. They have many different ways to execute what they need to do to achieve the outcome that is desired. So how can we bring an athlete from stage 1 to stage 3 with feedback? The red line would be that feedback, and coming back to the random practice organization, it'll be that intra-task interference. So when an athlete is in stage 1 and they are experiencing their own internal variability, we really don't need to impose much variability ourselves as coaches. As their variability drops and they get a handle on the skill, we can then intervene with increased variability through cues, drills, feedback, whatever it may be, to help bridge the gap between stage 1 and stage 3. And then as they progress further into stage 3, we can pull back the variability that we introduce and make sure that they can perform that skill well. We can make sure it stabilizes and actualizes. So where do we start with our feedback or our contextual interference? We know from recent studies that it starts and ends with force expressed in the appropriate direction at or for the appropriate time. In other words, the orientation of force is greater than the magnitude of force. And so within that orientation component, we have horizontal and vertical. And this is how I'll often structure some of the practice organizations when targeting sprinting mechanics with team sport athletes. But before we go into that, there's a couple questions that we need to cover. First, is individualization necessary? I often get this question from team sports settings who have a high number of athletes with very little time, and it seems that they get stuck on this idea of individualization, and they get concerned that if they cannot individualize teaching of sprint mechanics, then there's no point to even try. I would argue that individualization for a lot of team sport athlete groups is not necessary. And essentially that's because they're not competent in what sprinting is or what it should feel like. They haven't been taught or they haven't been taught properly. And until they have a baseline understanding or a baseline level of competence, individualization is not really necessary. We must just focus on the fundamentals. But say we do have a large group and they are competent. And then individualization, you could argue, is necessary. To achieve the individualization, there's a couple steps that we can take. One is give autonomy towards the group. So this may be a matter of projection, rhythm, and rise. Say the group understands what projection, rhythm, and rise are and what they mean and how they're meant to be executed. Then you can address the group as a whole and tell them to pick which one they want to work on. From there, if they're going to work on projection, maybe you give them a cue to think about or a drill to execute. And the same for rhythm and rise. That way you have a really quick conversation during a rest break, addressing the group as a whole, and they can start to choose what they think they need to work on most. This can also be really telling because it can provide you as the coach some insight into where they think their weaknesses are and if that matches up with your ideas. Secondly, we can utilize waterfall starts. So if we line the group up as a whole, we could have 20 people on the line and they just go one after the other. As soon as the first one goes, maybe they're 5 meters into the rep or a few steps, then the next athlete goes. This allows us as a coach to maybe stand on the side and start to take in more of the execution on an individualized level. From here, we can start to shout out individual cues, or we can use our staff around us to help distribute the cues and the feedback to each and every athlete. Within this, we'll also utilize various start positions. Here's a couple notes on some of the most common ones. With drop-in starts, they're a little bit harder for projection and rise. I'd say moderately hard to execute rhythm, and they're much easier to modulate intensity. 2-point starts are harder to modulate that intensity, easier for the projection and the rhythm, and moderate to execute the rise. Within lateral starts, the reason I include this is because I often work with Major League Baseball players. I often see a base of support that is awfully wide and posture that is upright. Essentially, they do not have the ability to extend out and to push off of both feet. They take a long time before that center of mass passes over the lead foot and they begin to use that foot to apply force. And they also don't have enough flexion within their joints to then extend out of. With prone start positions is a way to pressure test the stabilization and actualization of skillful components. It's a unique challenge, one that doesn't often get executed in many sports. It can make it a little bit easier for projection, rhythm, and rise at times if an athlete is coordinated and comfortable with that movement, and sometimes it becomes much more difficult. So understanding the population and where this may fit becomes key. Next, I want to go into an example of a first session. This would be with an athlete or a group of athletes that have the goal of skill acquisition. They simply just want to learn the technical aspects of sprinting. A few objectives that I'm going to have on that first session are to rehearse some sprint drills, as I feel this will provide context and coordination for the athletes. I want to figure out what they know and what they don't know. I want to know what has biased and influenced them over the time. Have they been taught certain things, and are those things true? Are they things that I believe in? Are they things that will hold on? Or are they myths that we need to try to combat? And if so, I need to understand the root cause and where they come from and be careful with how I do so. Next, I'm going to teach the concepts of projection, rhythm, and rise. So this first session is a lot of talking, really, a lot of education. This leads back into the idea of competency that we mentioned before regarding individualization. I want to make sure that the athlete or the group of athletes understands what I'm talking about when I'm referring to projection, rhythm, and rise, so that we can begin to provide some autonomy and individualization later on. Lastly, I simply want to observe some accels and some sprints. I want to see where they're at. I want to see if they fit into any previous mental models that I may have developed, and then it'll give me some guidance onto what the next steps may be. So that first session is just getting them moving, getting them going through some drills and some sprints, figuring out what they know and don't know, and then really setting up the rest of our time together. I want to finish this video off with a couple video examples. Here we've got a drop-in start. So we'll watch it a couple times. We'll talk about what we see and then how we might intervene. As we mentioned before, the drop-in can be a little bit harder to understand the projection, to execute and feel the projection. And I'd say that's what we're seeing right here. The athlete quickly cycles behind themselves. They open up decently well, but then they don't strike the ground and they don't reverse that action. There's no scissor action between the limbs. So a bit of a push on the first step, and then we'll see the heels flick up and behind. Loss of front side mechanics and no real projection thereafter. So how might we intervene? How might we make it easier for him to execute the projection? We could give him a cue. We could have him think about, again, I mentioned he's not striking the ground very well, so maybe we have him imagine he's at a carnival, and there's a game where you've got the sledgehammer and you hit the scale, and then the lights go up a vertical pole, and based on how much force you put into that, it lights up higher and higher. So tell him we just want, with each step, each time he strikes the ground, he wants that to register to a little bit higher on that scale. That could be a cue that we would intervene with. If we want to just say less and give him a drill, maybe we put a stick or a baseball bat on his back or a hurdle board, have him go out of a 2-point start, and that'll force him to really push out. He doesn't have the arms to use as a counterbalance, so it forces him to come back into the ground and allows him a little bit easier of an environment to execute the projection. Here we've got a block start. Same thing, we'll watch it. We'll talk about what we see and how we might intervene. Notice right away, step 2, the athlete casts out. Notice how tall of a posture he has at this point. Because of that, he hasn't produced any horizontal speed. Now he's pushing really late, flicking the heels up behind again, struggling to get up to speed. So all that comes from this first step. No push out of that right side, cast out in front, and then he pops himself up. Since we have blocks in this video, it may just be a matter of understanding how to come out of the blocks. And in actuality, that was part of the case for this athlete. They did not have much experience coming from the blocks. So maybe you just need some increased repetition with that, or maybe you want to dial it back. It could be a matter of using no blocks at all, or maybe you take one block away and he just pushes out of the front block. Start to decrease the challenge and the complexity a little bit and slowly work their way there. Last video here, we have a 2-point acceleration. I'd say it's a pretty good acceleration. The first few steps are pretty clean, but then he struggles through the transition and through the rise. You see him get stuck in a down position and then pop up pretty quick, again losing front side mechanics. If we wanted to intervene with a cue, we could talk about this athlete wearing a belt buckle. And there'd be somebody on the end of the field, and he wants to just gradually expose that belt buckle to that person at the end of the field. And by the time he gets to the last cone, he wants to be upright, pushing those hips forward so it's extremely visible. But it's just a gradual point to get there. We also might just have this athlete use a drop-in in between 2-point accelerations. This will lower the intensity and allow for increased repetition to try to execute that rise. Since he's not coming from such a low position, it's not quite as hard to find that rise, that gradual increase with each step. And again, it just allows for more reps as the intensities are a bit lower. Hopefully that provided a good overview on intent and what we can do through our practice design and how we provide feedback.